There are lots of foods whose names are not great. Head cheese, pork butt, cockaliki. But for me, today's dish takes the cake. Farts of Portingale, or Portuguese farts. I really hate that word, so I apologize ahead of time for the amount of times you're about to hear it. Farts of Portingale were a popular meatball in Elizabethan England, right during the time of Shakespeare. So while you contemplate what other videos are going to get suggested once you hit that like button, I'm going to find out what a Portuguese fart tastes like. This time, on Tasting History. And most dear actors, eat no onions, nor garlic, for we are to utter sweet breath. That was the aptly named character Bottom from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, imploring his actors not to eat foods that would make their breath smell bad right before they go on stage. Funny enough, he had no prohibition against eating farts of Portingale, probably because they would have actually made your breath smell sweet. See, there are actually two concurrent recipes in England for this dish, and they are wildly different from each other. It's really confusing. The first appears in a book of cookery, very necessary for all such as delight therein. Its recipe for farts of Portingale is one of lightly fried balls of dough mixed with honey and spices, extremely different from the one just a few years later in 1597 that we're making today. It comes from the second edition of The Good Housewife's Handmaide for the Kitchen by Thomas Dawson. How to make farts of Portingale. Take a piece of a leg of mutton, mince it small and season it with cloves, mace, pepper, and salt, and dates minced with currans. Then roll it into round rolls, and so into little balls, and so boil them in a little beef broth, and so serve them forth. And so it actually sounds pretty easy, especially because I got some wonderful tips from Ellie at The Past is a Foreign Pantry. She made them recently and had some pointers on how to make sure they stick together while you're cooking them. I'm going to link to her site in the description. It's fantastic. It's filled with wonderful old recipes as well as some very witty commentary. Wonder why I'm such a fan. So for this recipe, you'll need 1 pound or 450 grams leg of mutton. You can also use lamb. Mutton's really actually quite hard to find. I had to call a dozen butchers before I found someone who had it. So go ahead and use lamb. Frankly, it's probably going to be more tender if you do that anyway. 1/8 teaspoon ground clove, 1/2 teaspoon ground mace, 1/2 teaspoon black pepper, 1 teaspoon of salt, 1/3 cup or 60 grams of dates, 1/3 cup or 60 grams of currants, and 1 liter or 1 quart of unsalted beef stock. If all you can find is salted beef stock, that's fine, but cut back on the additional salt that you add earlier on in the recipe. So first, the recipe calls for us to mince the meat small. And really because these are going to be like meatballs, you almost want it like ground meat. And so you can do this with a knife. I started out with a knife and got tired very quickly, so I switched over to my food processor, and I would suggest you do the same. If it's not done finely enough, the balls will just disintegrate in the water and or in the broth, and you don't want that. Then slice up your dates into small pieces, as well as your currants if you're working with a larger currant. Now back in the day in England, they had red currants, black currants, and currants of Corinth, which are modern day Zante currants, which are probably actually going to be the easiest for most people to find, so use whatever you want. Then in a large bowl, add your mutton, your dates, and your currants, and mix everything together. Then add in all of your spices, and mix until everything is well incorporated. Then take a bit of the mixture and roll it into a ball about 1.5 inches in diameter. The recipe should make about 12 or 13 lovely little farts. Next, you're going to pour your beef stock into a medium pot and set it over medium-high heat until it's simmering. Then drop your farts in the water a half dozen at a time and let them simmer for 6 to 7 minutes, during which time we can take a look at how these poor little meatballs got saddled with such an unfortunate name. The year was 1504, and the Right Honourable William Warham was just enthroned as the Archbishop of Canterbury. After the ceremony there was a grand feast, and only the most noble and regal guests of the kingdom were in attendance. But despite the pomp and circumstance of the evening, we have to allow for the fact that at some point during the meal, it's possible that the new archbishop uttered the phrase, "What a delectable little fart." That's right. Farts of Portingale made it on the menu. But why would they name them that? Well, there's a lot of controversy around the etymology of the word, but there is a consensus forming that it was probably just a crude joke. And that's because these farts are not unique. In 15th century Germany and Austria, you could order a dish of Nonnenfürze, or nun farts. And they were essentially just a puffed up ball of sweet pastry dough. In Canada, you can still order nun farts, though they say it in French, and it makes sense because Canadians love fart jokes. And in the most respected French cookbook of the 17th century, Le Cuisinier François, the cookbook that set the tone for French haute cuisine for 300 years, had a recipe for a sugared beignet called, shield your ears children, pet de putain, or farts of a whore. I'm serious. So the thing that all these international farts have in common is that they tend to be little balls of pastry puffed up with hot air inside, so you can kind of see the joke writes itself. But our farts of Portingale, which I think has the least offensive name of the bunch, probably got its name just because it was the same shape and size as the other farts. I mean, that's why there are two recipes with the same name for two totally different dishes. So weird. But either way, the name is really fitting because at the time that our recipe was written, 1597, the hottest ticket in London was to go see a Shakespeare play at the Rose Theatre. And old Willie loved a fart joke. "A man may break a word with you, sir, and words are but wind. I and break it in your face, so he break it not behind." Now that was from the Comedy of Errors, so of course you're going to find fart jokes in that, but Shakespeare didn't mind letting his more serious, tragic figures let a fart joke slip in every now and then. King Lear implored, "Blow, winds, and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow." So like I said, pretty fitting that these little meatballs were thought to be served at the food stalls outside of the Rose and the Globe theaters where Shakespeare played his plays. Though those farts probably wouldn't have been as spiced as the ones that we're using today because spices were still relatively expensive, and many of the patrons going to see Shakespeare's plays didn't have the funds for a fancy fart. Your groundling and gallery commoner buys his sport by the penny. Thomas Dekker was right. For only a penny, you could have gone to see Richard Burbage play Hamlet. But you would have had to stand the entire time, hence the term groundlings. So, if you didn't bring your own food, which you could, then about 2 hours in, you might want to sneak out to the food stalls to get a bit of nosh. During the excavation of the Rose and Globe theaters in the late 80s, archaeologists found evidence that audience members were enjoying things such as figs, grapes, nuts, oysters, cockles, cold chicken, pastries, and little meat dishes like the ones that we're making today. And that reminds me. Another option available to patrons was to go next door to the Ale House, which happened to be owned by John Hemmings of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the troupe of players that Shakespeare wrote for. Hemmings was making money on and off stage. Here's to good business. So as I top off my liquid courage, I think that I'm ready to see what a fart of Portingale tastes like. So after about 6 or 7 minutes, or until they reach an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 Celsius, take the mutton balls out of the stock using a slotted spoon and set aside to cool. And then just repeat until they're all cooked and you're ready to eat. So here we are, farts of Portingale. There is absolutely no accent that I can use that's going to make this dish sound good. But I have to say, these farts smell delectable. Truly, they smell a bit like the holidays. It's a little bit Christmassy. Yeah. There's nothing in here that doesn't sound appealing. It's just the name. So I don't know why I'm so hesitant. So I'm not going to hesitate anymore, and I'm going to eat this fart. It's delicious. If you use lamb, it's going to be a little more tender, I think. The mutton's a little chewy, but not overly so. It's actually really, really good. I had heard from from people who had made them that the clove could be overpowering, so that's why I went with just 1/8 of a teaspoon, and I can still taste the clove. So I wouldn't use much more than that, because you still want to taste the mace and the other things in there. What's interesting is that they're quite sweet. They're not like a modern meatball at all. They're, the texture is kind of, but they're very sweet because of the currants and the dates. But they're really nice. And I like how they got just a little bit of like a crust on the outside, which I thought would only happen if you were baking them. I didn't expect that from boiling, so happy accident. Now these might have been served perhaps with some sort of sauce, I don't know, but honestly you don't need it. There's plenty of flavor here. They're really quite wonderful. So I encourage you to go home, make your own farts of Portingale, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.